If you had a boat, you'd go out on the ocean. If you had a pony, you'd ride it on your boat and go straight to the New Discourses Preserving Liberty Conference at sea November 15th through 22nd, 2026. Round trip sailing out of Tampa, Florida through the Caribbean, talking about all of the top ideas of New Discourses. We're going to be talking, of course, about American liberty. We're going to be talking about totalitarianism, communism, fascism, probably Islamism, you never know. We're going to hit all the important stuff. So I hope you will join us. I hope you will come and meet all of the different people who support New Discourses and want to come to something like this, because every time I have a conference, that's the part people love most, is all the friends they make, all the people that are in this New Discourses community. And I hope you will join us on this ship in November for a week-long excursion of learning and fun and conversation and fellowship. So that's, again, November 15th through 22nd, the Preserving Liberty Conference at Sea. Everything you need to know, everything you need to do is at ndcruise.com. The website is ND for New Discourses, ndcruise.com. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the New Discourses podcast, and we are going back into Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century for another episode of my series called The Myth of the Blood, which explores Alfred Rosenberg's 1930 book called The Myth of the 20th Century, which is I think it actually is. I looked this up. It said it's the second most important book in the Nazi regime. It's where he lays out the ideology the Nazis were supposed to have. Now, this episode's kind of fun because I read the third chapter of the book in its entirety yesterday. I'd been holding off on that because I hadn't done the second chapter's podcast yet, and I didn't want to get ahead of myself. So I sat down and read the whole third chapter. I'm shook. It's weird. It's so weird. And in fact, how weird is it? It's so weird that even though Rosenberg was a celebrated member of the Nazi Party, directly worked with Hitler, was given an award for this book specifically, that this book was strongly recommended, which is basically to say mandated for educated Nazis to own. So it sold over 1 million copies in the Third Reich during the time, I guess till 45. Even though all that, this chapter in particular is so strange, is so peculiar, that it led Hitler to privately dismiss this book, even though he publicly praised it as a bunch of, quote, mystical nonsense. And this book is crazy, right? So the episode, this one gets to be titled WTF is Nazism. I mean, if you followed the podcast for a while, you know there's been a WTF is social emotional learning and a WTF is Christian nationalism, when I discovered really weird roots going on in those things. And now we have WTF is Nazism based off of this third chapter of the book. Unlike what I usually do, I'll frame this all out and I'll dive into it. This chapter is titled Mysticism in Action, and not in. And I'm going to go ahead and, frame out what the series is about and what's going on. But before I do that, I'm actually going to break with my normal. I'm going to read a little bit to you from near the end of the chapter. I'm not going to read the stuff around this, so it's all going to be out of context. I just want to give you a taste of how weird this chapter is. And then eventually there will be more podcasts on this chapter, because I'm just going to read a short part from the beginning of this chapter for this episode to give you the flavor of what I'm talking about. This chapter is pretty kind of in depth, and I'll explain what I mean later. But I'm going to read this part from near the end, 3/4 of the way through the chapter, that just kind of jumps off the page. Is super weird, to give you a taste of what I'm talking about, and we'll put it in context later. But first of all, I'll read this short sentence, and I'm going to read actually about a paragraph and a half, or a paragraph plus a short paragraph. So he writes somewhere near the 3/4 mark of this chapter, the dynamic German nature never expresses itself in flight from the world, but in overcoming it, in struggle with it. This occurs in a twofold manner in godly, religious, and artistic metaphysics, and in a Luciferian empiricism. So you don't usually run into people like just invoking Lucifer as being on their side, but here we have that, which is pretty interesting. Now, the godly metaphysics that he's talking about here are more like Nietzsche's metaphysics. It's not exactly Nietzsche's metaphysics, but to summarize it, it would be that the Germans do great things because they detach themselves from worrying about doing good. So they see goodness or doing goodness as something that withholds them. And when it says, when he's talking about, flight from the world, etc., what he's actually doing is comparing himself against, and just for the context of that part, against the Chinese under Lao Tzu, who had his Taoist approach of, meditation or repose, the Hindu or Indian approach, and the Buddhist approach of withdrawal and contemplation. But also the Jewish approach, particularly, he spends a lot of time setting up the whole last quarter or third of the chapters about these kind of ideas in comparison to the German. But the idea in the Jewish world would be that that God does great, and because the Jews do good. And so this is like a refutation of withdrawal from the world, and then those so-called godly religious metaphysics are this idea of renouncing restriction by goodness in order to do greatness, right? And so I'll read that again, and I'm going to read this paragraph just below that. The dynamic German nature never expresses itself in flight from the world, but in overcoming it, in struggle with it. This occurs in a twofold manner in godly religious artistic metaphysics and in a Luciferian empiricism. This idea of overcoming the world in struggle with it is also very progressive and transformative in nature. Now, this next part, it goes on. I'm reading from a picture I took, so I had to arrange that a little bit, sorry. One must differentiate, he goes on, between what is of Lucifer, good, and what belongs to Satan, evil. Satanic describes the moral side of the mechanistic conquest of the world. It is dictated by purely instinctive motives. It is seen in the Jewish attitude toward the world. Luciferian describes the struggle for the subjection of matter without having the prerequisite of subjective interest as a driving motive. So in other words, you want to conquer the world not because you want to gather material wealth. That's Luciferian, that's good. But wanting to conquer the world for material wealth and whatever, that's Satanic and Jewish. That's literally what he has said here. The first, he says, that's Satanic, springs from an uncreative character and will, The first springs from an uncreative character and will consequently never find anything, never discover, never really invent, while the second, that's Luciferian, compels natural laws with the aid of, compels natural laws with the aid of natural laws, follows their track, and builds works to make matter useful. It is easy to understand that the Luciferian conquest of the world can easily become satanic. For this reason, in a principally Luciferian era, such as that which vanished in the World War, Jewry necessarily finds it doubly easy to infiltrate and seek its possibilities for profit. So that's a very strange piece of Nazi belief and ideology that shows up late in this chapter, and we'll come back to that in another podcast later. But you hear that he is saying Luciferianism is good, that Luciferianism characterized the age but was defeated in World War I, and that the vacuum created led to Jewish opportunism bringing satanic evil belief in because of its pursuit of material power and profit. So wanting to conquer the world is Luciferian, is good, is Germanic spirit in the Nazi estimation. So they aspire to be Luciferian in that way, but to do so for material profit instead of detached from material profit is evil and Jewish and satanic. So like I said, this episode is going to be called WTF is Nazism, because WTF are we looking at here? This isn't just what we're familiar with on the surface. Something really dark and weird is going on here, as you can now tell. So we'll go ahead and turn our attention to the chapter after I kind of remind you why we're doing this and kind of frame things. So the Myth of the Blood series, like I said, explores this book, The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg, who was the chief ideologist of the Third Reich under Hitler. It was his job to write the ideology that Nazis would come to believe. Most Nazis did not believe this. A lot of the Nazi brass believed a lot of it. Hitler is strongly concordant with it, but in this chapter we have to add the caveat that he considered this to be mystical nonsense. He also went so far as to praise this book, give it an award, praise Rosenberg, keep him employed in this effort, but however, to prevent him or this book from being considered official Nazi doctrine like Mein Kampf was and the 25 Principles of the Nazi Party were. So this is something that Hitler thought went a little too far into the cuckoo world. I don't know if the Nazis ever would have bought into this. But anyway, this is a really kooky chapter. But we already just heard from that like WTF snippet about Luciferianism and the World War, aka World War I, kind of another appeal to what I'm saying for the whole point of this series as I explore this book. And that what you have when the Nazis are rising to power, because I think we need to understand, but not necessarily humanize what's going on here, is that the Germans were having a lot of problems, right? We're not going to do the Nazi experiment thing. They proposed an experiment to solve it. It was a catastrophe, World War and the Holocaust. Yada, yada, yada. What were the contents of the experiment? That's the Nazi experiment approach. Here, the Myth of the Blood is what was going on in the world that they were trying to deal with. So you have the humiliation of the German psyche is one of the main hypotheses that I've brought forward as a result of losing World War I and becoming basically the heel of Europe. They're under the boot of the rest of Western Europe, particularly France and Britain. They are not happy with their diminished status. They have tremendous economic troubles as a result, but also as a result of the war. But the psyche itself couldn't handle the fact that they lost the war. So this great European something, Nordic something, Aryan spirit or whatever that characterized the German Empire before World War I got totally humiliated. And this cataclysm of this war was actually incomprehensible. But as I said in all the other episodes, the cataclysm of World War I is partly the result of the fact of it being the first fully mechanized war. This and chemical warfare, biological warfare. If they had nukes, they would have used them. They didn't have them. So this was a war unlike any other. You're talking about poison gas, deadly gas, spreading diseases on purpose, trench warfare, the first tanks, the first bombs being thrown. They weren't dropped. They were thrown from airplanes, machine guns. I mean, just a completely different warfare environment. And in a real sense, it was like literally throwing human beings on both sides or on all fronts really into the like giant machinery of a blender and just killing in ways that have never been even contemplated before. So there's a cataclysmic shock here that also results in the humiliation of the Germans, who get blamed basically for making it a world war in the first place. But this is happening because science is maturing. Technology is coming about. The Industrial Revolution has gotten to the point where we're not just turning out textiles and cotton and so on through industrial processes, but we're building machines that build machines. We're building machines that build machines of war, as the war showed us, but we're also building really complicated, powerful industrial tools that the world has never seen before. And this is not just a technological shift, but this is a shift that's coming on the back of the maturation of the sciences, which is this giant kind of almost all of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century are kind of the period of the maturation of the sciences. And in the maturation of the sciences, you have a lot of what used to be kind of terra firma in terms of how people believed about the world getting uprooted and destroyed, whether that's religious belief getting absolutely shaken, including by the theory of evolution, which is very pertinent to the Nazi experiment, but also, just the mechanistic universe of classical physics, the enormously bizarre but mathematically describable universe of classical electricity and magnetism. eventually, even as we're talking about here by 1930, you have the beginnings of the emergence of quantum mechanics, mature chemistry, mature biology, special and general relativity, so total upheavals in physics, advances in nuclear sciences that are very confusing. So here, the setting is that the world is suddenly shifting off of a way of approaching everything, basically, and thinking before the maturation of the sciences to one afterwards. And this is all happening at the beginning of the 20th century, plunk down in the middle of that, but actually a little bit past the halfway mark. It's also, filled with this kind of charlatanry. There are all of these, Theosophical Society comes in 1875. I forgot what the precursor to the Fabian Society was called without looking it up. It's like the Society for a Better Life or something like that. It's a really weird name. Erupting in the 1880s in London. You have all of these weird mystical societies kind of coming out of the secret societies of the previous era and finding kind of new footing. Like all kinds of weird stuff is happening in people's thinking. You have the birth of modern pharmacology. You have all kinds of changes happening. So my point is that this massive era of conceptual, epistemological, social disruption and transformation that's going on, plus the massive confusing cataclysm and dislocation of World War I, almost as like an exclamation mark in the middle of it, plus the fact of the humiliated German psyche left the Germans looking for a new story about themselves. They used to have a story about themselves that had lots of elements of what they end up telling themselves, but as Rosenberg says when he starts the book, the point has come where the entire history of the world needs to be rewritten, and that's what he's undertaking. So the Nazis adopted a myth about themselves, the myth of the blood, that race science, that blood is central to the fundamental meaning of what it is to be human, and that race science is the explanation for how the human world works, the laws of nature, and this is based on an incorrect understanding of the theory of evolution as it was in the 20s and 30s as Hitler and some of the other Nazis picked it up, combined with Ariosophy, which is this mystical pseudoscience that was based off of Theosophy, which is another mystical, I don't even know if pseudoscience, it's like New Age belief system. And anyway, they're consecrating this into a new belief system for themselves. In fact, in this chapter, Rosenberg repeatedly refers to the myth of the blood as the religion of the blood and as their religion, the Germanic religion, which is this idea that character, value, everything is determined by the blood, and people are put under the duress of ideological belief structures that are alien to their blood, and that the mixing of blood always causes the weakening of the stronger and the destruction of the kind, and so on and so forth. So this is this therapeutic balm, what I'm saying. You have this shifting sand of how you're supposed to believe. The old religions aren't quite cutting it. Science isn't quite mature. There's a lot of pseudoscience and a lot of nonsense and mysticism floating around. And people are looking for a new way to conceive of themselves and their being. And then you have, like I said, the cataclysm of World War I knocks Germany right the F off its high horse. And they are looking for a therapeutic balm in the form of an ideology, and this weird myth of the blood is what they pick up. Now, this chapter dives into, we've already talked about what that contains. I even sort of summarized it. In the previous episodes, we explored how much that puts them at odds with other lines of thought. The second chapter of the book is called Love and Honor, and the German conception is based on honor and duty and loyalty and all this hard-ass stuff. And that's how Germans in their blood, their Nordic blood from Atlantis, actually it characterizes the European man. And then you have all of this other stuff based in love, the charity of the Catholic Church, which is false. It's only for the laity. The leadership is actually ruthless. So it's a scam, and it's based off of African, Syrian, Etruscan nonsense. And he compares it against the universalism, not just of like India and the whatever, but also the universalism that he attributes to to Jews and Freemasons, and then he also compares it against the other form of love, as he talks about is sympathy, which he says is characteristic of the Russian. This is all to explain why the German conception of life is superior to those alternatives. And in the previous episode, volume 4 of this series, we explored how much he hates the Catholic Church, which is a big theme through the rest of this chapter too. But he really is down on the Catholic Church, not only for being false and fraudulent and everything else, but as I said, his real objective was to fulfill one of his ideological missions, was to make Nazis, was to get Nazis to believe Nazism. And the problem is that Germans were overwhelmingly Christian. They were broken down 2-to-1 Protestant to Catholic, but they were almost all one or the other. Less than 2% of Germans were not Christian when the Nazis were trying to rise and eventually take over. Now, this presented a problem because if you know anything about Nazism, it's not very Christian. As a matter of fact, a race science directly violates one of the most famous teachings of Christianity, which is neither Jew nor Greek. In other words, everybody who's Christian is Christian. It's a universalist belief once you're in the faith, and you don't designate by race, you don't separate anymore after that. And that's intolerable. So the goal was, how do you get German Christians, many of whom are very serious and devout in their faith, how do you get them off the Christianity and onto Nazism? And what Rosenberg built and is basically laid out in many ways and first really described was this thing called positive Christianity, which is derived from something that other German poets like Goethe had believed in. It's also written in the Nazi program from literally a decade earlier. The 25-point program, point 24, says that the religion of the Reich will be positive Christianity without ever specifying what it is. But the idea was going to be that we're going to recast Jesus as misrepresented by the churches. He's actually an anti-Jewish Aryan hero in the Near East and the Levant who's been mischaracterized and turned into this character of passive power, that his redemptive story is that he was put to death and died and was resurrected on the third day. And that wasn't something he actively did. What he actively did was like trashed the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he like crusaded against stupid Jewish legalism and greed and all these other things. So Jesus becomes an Aryan folk hero in the Germanic mold with an entire even mythology of how he got there. Pauline Christianity is struck down with vigor. He's not a fan of Paul. He's also not a fan of Peter because he's not a fan of the Catholic Church at all. And he says, in fact, that the Catholic Church, as you heard in the previous episode, if you listened, that the Catholic Church basically deposed Jesus from Christianity entirely to put its own power structure in place. And I know a lot of my Protestant listeners are like, well, yeah, kind of, but we're not going to get into all that. The point is that his job was to take this, 1/3 of the population, so roughly 30 million Catholics, 2/3 of the population is Protestants, so nearly 60 million Protestants, plus or minus, a few million here or there, however that works out. And he's going to transform these people into Nazis by telling them that their faith tradition that they've held up to this point is at odds with the Nazism of the Fuhrer that they've now aligned with, in the movement that they're aligned with. And here are the lies that the church has told, so that he can hollow out reliance and belief in the church and its narratives about Jesus, replace this with a different Jesus, the positive Christianity story. But the ultimate goal of this is to get them off the religion. So far we've heard him breaking down Christianity. Now here's where he's going to start saying what you have to fill that in with. And this chapter is actually super Christian, but in a Gnostic, mystical, heretical way, heavily based off of the writings of Johannes Eckert, who was 12th and 13th centuries, I think, maybe it's 13th and 14th centuries, German Dominican friar, who probably would have been declared a heretic and thrown out of the church, but he died before his trial. Like, he was already in trouble. But we'll get into this. So the rest of this, I already read to you that Lucifer thing, like the WTF is Nazism about. This is my point. Okay, so the idea is this book so far, and the Nazi ideology that he's presenting, is meant to cast a kind of therapeutic identity for the German who's going to cleave to this thing in order to as a salve for his confusion and feeling of loss in the world, his bitterness, his anger, his humiliation, his shame about everything to do with World War I and everything that has come and gone, and the confusion of the world changing as the sciences mature, and the cataclysm of World War I and the struggles of the period. He's going to take that person and break down their current religious belief, and he's going to stuff into the whole a counterfeit that looks and sounds very Christian, but the goal is to deliver a vehicle of a Nazi ideology that is the myth of the blood, that blood is determinative, and so the race is the only thing. And so, as I've said before, it's basically seize the means of racial production in order to establish a progressive Reich that will advance and maybe even complete humanity. That's all well and good, but then there's a mystical element. And this isn't just to do with the positive Christianity, although you can hear how this is where he's putting in some of that filler that's going to move from one side to the other. My thinking here is, and from what I looked into it a little bit, Rosenberg appears to have really believed this crap. And some of the other Nazi leadership believed either this or other mystical nonsense that was kind of similar. There was a lot of disagreement about which mysticisms to believe. But what you're about to hear is, pretty indicative beyond the Lucifer thing of WTF is Nazism. So this is the mysticism and action chapter of Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century. This is what Nazis were allegedly supposed to start to come to believe was their real national religion, rooted in an expression of their blood. But he doesn't cover, I don't think, those specific words in the kind of relatively short part I'm about to read to you. So, from the very beginning of this chapter, which is chapter 3, he says, "With its diverse ties to the earth, the concept of honor can be found embodied in the lives of the Nordic Viking, the Teutonic knight, the Prussian officer, the Baltic Hansa, the German soldier, and the German peasant. Together with inner freedom, it's the most important life-shaping law. This motif of honor appears as the spiritual base in poetic art, from the ancient epics onward, from Walther von Vogelweide and the Knight's songs to Kleist and Goethe. But there is still another fine branch on which we can follow the working of Nordic honor, and that's in the German mystic." So this is about to get super weird. Okay, so when I first read this chapter, I first read the first couple sections. I first read the chapter in whole yesterday from when I'm recording this, but when I first, several weeks ago, like 2 months ago probably, I read the first few pages of this chapter and was just like, holy crap. What the hell is this? Okay, so you have this whole idea of inner freedom. The inner freedom is what comes with having honor. That's the foundation that he's built. If you want to hear about that, go listen to the previous 5 episodes. I know this is episode 5, but one of the episodes is in the Nazi experiment, and you'll get the taste of this. Now he's going to say that actually one of the most important branches upon which honor hangs is the idea of German mysticism in a uniquely German mystical way. And this is where we get to WTF as Nazism. He goes on, "The mystic releases himself more and more from the entanglements of the material world." So we have an invocation of mysticism, and then we hear that there's something wrong with the material world from which the mystic has to separate. And so, somebody's probably starting to think, this is going to get really Gnostic really fast. The thing is the answer is, in the kind of generic broad sense of hidden inner knowledge about the self that liberates you from the problems that you have, the answer is yes. But in the specifics, no, not actually. This is going to be different. So the mystic releases himself more and more from the entanglements of the material world. Let me clarify what I was just saying. The Gnostic mentality holds that the material world is not just an illusion, but an evil one, or not just evil, but also illusory. It is an evil illusion created by an evil demon that wanted to imprison us in our lives, and that the knowledge, the gnosis, the secret hidden inner knowledge is that we ourselves are spiritual beings that are imprisoned within the material. But our spiritual nature can surpass the prison, and we can somehow escape and reunify with the true God that is beyond the demon that people have mistakenly called God. So when you hear people saying that God or Yahweh or Jehovah is a demon that imprisons people, you're usually hearing Gnosticism. And I will add, just to be very clear, that Rosenberg later in the chapter says that explicitly. He says that Jehovah is a demon. He does not, however, say that Jehovah is a demon who has imprisoned people in the world, and his mysticism is not dependent on that particular belief. So this is going to diverge from that. But they believe that the material world is a trap, a prison, a fallen and profane thing that sullies their ultimate spiritual nature. Now, different schools of broadly construed Gnostic thinking hold different things about the spirit. The Hermetic schools, which use gnosis in the sense of a hidden inner truth, see this idea of you elevating yourself spiritually to escape, but they're generally positive about creation. They're not negative about creation. The Gnostics see it as a prison created by a demon called the demiurge that people mistake for the creator or for God, and therefore worship. And that they see through this, and that they can transcend this by reunifying themselves spiritually with the real God, who they can come to know through hints and clues in the natural world and in the scriptures, including, apocryphal scriptures like the Gospel of Thomas and so on. So there's a lot of different views, but none of them are really happy about the material world. And in this case, the mystic is going to release himself more and more from the entanglements of the material world, and therefore will be more spiritual than he will materialistic. He recognizes that the impulsive aspects of our existence, such as pleasure and power, or even so-called good works, are not essential for the welfare of the soul. Now, this is a different view from the Gnostic view, but I want to emphasize what I was saying earlier about the metaphysic that he appeals to, the Luciferian empiricism, and then this godly metaphysic that he referred to. So the impulsive aspects of our existence, such as pleasure and power, or even so-called good works. This is why I said that the metaphysic increasingly is that the Nazi mystic will not be bound by doing good, right? The idea is that rules of good and wrong, right and wrong, or good and evil are actually imposed by people who want to control you spiritually, like the Catholic Church, and that to do great requires you to have a more expansive, more liberated view. And in fact, that these things are not essential for the welfare of the soul, he says. But again, this is not going to be strictly Gnostic. It's also not strictly Hermetic. This is something different. Although I would classify it in my broad lowercase g Gnostic category as very Gnostic. The more he overcomes earthly bonds, all the greater, richer, and more godlike does he feel himself inwardly become. So a lot of these Gnostic belief systems, to use the term broadly, believe that you in fact actually spiritually already are identical to God, or that you are God, period, and that you are to elevate yourself from understanding yourself to be the third person of the Godhead to the second person, which is the mind of God, or Christ mind, or you've heard Christ consciousness probably from some people that you're a little suspicious of these days. And then eventually that allows you to open the door to reunite with the Father, with the One. That idea is actually kind of underneath this, but in a different way from the Gnostic and Hermetic conceptions. But I keep interrupting because I need you to understand enough Gnosticism to know what I'm talking about, especially since I'm like paranoid that it's wrong to call it Gnostic, but it's kind of Gnostic. It's not Gnostic, but it's Gnostic, if you will. So let me just go ahead and kind of like summarize it. Let me just read the damn paragraph. So the mystic releases himself more and more from the entanglements of the material world. He recognizes that the impulsive aspects of our existence, such as pleasure and power, or even the so-called good works, are not essential for the welfare of the soul. The more he overcomes his earthly bonds, all the greater, richer, and more godlike does he feel himself inwardly become, and that godlike is capitalized, by the way. He discovers a purely spiritual power, feeling that his soul represents a center of strength to which nothing can be compared. Such freedom and serenity of soul toward everything, even in the face of God, reveals the profoundest depths into which we can follow the Nordic concepts of honor and freedom. So you have freedom and serenity of soul toward even the face of God. So rather than like what you hear from Christian or Jewish sources that you would fall on your face before God and humble yourself before God, nope, equal. You have so much freedom and serenity of soul toward everything as a result of your awakening as a German spiritual mystic in this tradition, and that will reveal the profoundest depths into which we can follow the Nordic concepts of honor and freedom. So honor and freedom as the two pillar concepts that hold up what it means to be a German in values and character according to your blood actually provide you a pathway to become, or to feel at least, godlike inwardly. It is that mighty fortress of the soul, writes Rosenberg, that spark of which Meister Eckhart speaks again and again with awed admiration. It represents the most inward, the most sensitive, and yet the strongest essence of our race and culture. Now here there's a footnote outlining who Eckhart is. Eckhart refers to Johannes Eckhart, 1260 to 1328. So we're talking about late 13th, early 14th century, was a German philosopher, theologian, and of course famous mystic. He is the central figure in this chapter. Eckhart's influence has continued to grow in the years since Rosenberg wrote this book, and not only in German nations. I do not know what that refers to and did not look into it. But okay, so Johannes Eckhart I had to look into him a lot. He wrote a whole bunch of sermons. He was a Dominican friar. He had a huge movement around him about his kind of like really weird belief in God, and he wrote about it, and he was technically heretical according to Rosenberg. I don't know the truth of this. He was too influential and powerful to go after by the church directly, but near the end he crossed too much of a line. He bartered rather than getting burned at the stake or whatever, and declared a heretic. He bartered to be able to make a meeting with the Pope himself and nobody below, and he, by promising that if he was in error through his application of reason, that he would change or correct anything that he put down that was wrong. And then, like I said, he ends up dying before that meeting with the Pope. And then afterwards, the Catholic Church more or less declared what he was doing as heretical. They didn't make a big fuss about it. They didn't posthumously excommunicate him or prohibit his works or anything like that. But he's actually, I found a lot of his sermons on a website called Christian Classics. But if you read this stuff, I mean, I'm not exactly an Orthodox Christian myself in any regard, and I don't mean capital O Orthodox, I mean following the Orthodox teaching. But I can tell you right now that it is not Orthodox Christian belief. It is something different. He had these ideas like that first of all, he is kind of I think he might be the progenitor of the idea of the Godhead behind the Trinity. And so there is a Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, which he identified in the individual soul as the memory as Father, the reason as Son, and the will as Spirit. This has really strong overlaps with the Hermetic conception of the Trinity, but it's actually very unlikely to impossible that Eckhart would have known about the Hermetic texts, since they were not translated or brought into Europe for about another century and a half after he died. So he probably came up with this conception kind of on his own, but he's mirroring the Divine Trinity in the human soul, and thus thinking of the Divine Trinity in those terms: memory for the Father, reason for the Son, and will for the Spirit. But then there's this Godhead that's like the God behind the Trinity. So rather than an evil demiurge that's created the world, you have, he describes it in the terms of boiling over. Boiling and then boiling over. You have the Trinity boiling and then boiling over, and the boiling over is creation. So creation comes from the Trinity, which is the three manifestations in Christian theology of the Godhead. The Godhead is like what God really is behind the Trinity, but you don't have the Gnostic belief in an evil demiurge that has stolen power, created the world, and imprisoned all souls. You instead have the idea of a manifestation of God as the Trinity in three parts that has entered the world and boiled over and created the world. So the creation's actually good because it's a miracle of God himself. But that the real goal of spirituality and Christian belief and piety and so on is to connect to the Godhead directly without having to deal with these sort of intermediaries of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is very similar to the Gnostic construction. So it's not Gnostic because it's not seeing an evil demon in place of the world, a creator of the world. It sees God as the creator of the world, as in good God, as in Christian God, as in the same thing, except that the Trinity is not satisfactory, and there's a Godhead behind it, and the goal is to convene with that. And the way that you do that, since the world we live in is the boiling over of the Trinity, is that you withdraw from the world into yourself. And in fact, the goal is to become lonely enough in your soul. He has a very famous sermon on the loneliness of the soul that Rosenberg brings up specifically, that God not wanting to be separate from his creation, the Godhead itself, will then draw God near to you by withdrawing from everything that's created. And so by diving deeper and deeper into the loneliness of your soul, you draw God to you, at which point you can convene directly with God. But his other beliefs, are really weird. That's already not Christian standard Orthodox belief. His other beliefs are also very strange. Lots of beliefs about, how you can't be justified by works, but you basically prove your communion through acts of will, that the reason as the second part of the Godhead as manifested in the human soul, and will as the third part of the Godhead, spirit manifested in the human will, are like two-winged angels that are guided by the Father, which is memory. So being able to understand that what you've learned in the world, that these two-winged angels or creatures compel you into action so that you use your reason to drive your action, and your action goes out into the world. And that's the manifestation of bringing your soul. So there's a lot of will-driven, action-driven belief without this idea of justification through action, because all of it turns out to kind of be unnecessary or unimportant. So it's also got this strong element, again, of detachment from that. You aren't doing things because they're right or wrong, because they're good or bad, because they please God or upset him. That would all be the wrong way to do it. You're doing it because it's an expression of your will based on your reason, which is actually an expression of your soul's piece of the second and third person of the Godhead. And therefore, whatever you do, as long as it produces a good change in your relationship to God overall in the end, is good. So if you go out into the world and make a mistake, a catastrophic mistake, and you repent of it truly, and you grow because of it, the thing you did, in fact, wasn't evil. And this is really important to the sinlessness mentality. We talked before with Rosenberg about the sinlessness of the Arian. This is very important to rooting the sinlessness concept back down. Now, Rosenberg's claim is he's going to base everything in this whole chapter off of Eckhart, which is his own weird, not Christian, but Christianish theology, is actually that what Eckhart was doing was within the confines, the locked into the confines of the Catholic Church in the 13th century that he could, in 14th century, that he couldn't break from without getting set on fire or murdered. He is expressing that deep Nordic thing that's in his blood as a good German, and he even traces some of his lineage to say that he's truly an Aryan German. So that what it is that the Arianness is coming out. What he's actually doing is that he's expressing Arianism through Christianity. And you can see how this thing becomes, therefore, a huge part of the positive Christian bridge to take your Christians, get them to hollow out their belief in their churches as the spiritual authorities, replace it with this bullshit, and use them to move on to the true Germanic will that he wants to get to. So here we're talking about the German mystic, and the pinnacle German mystic is Meister Eckhart. Now, Meister Eckhart also was apparently a very significant inspiration to Jakob Boehme. And Jakob Boehme was, and I'm not saying his last name correctly because I'm not German. It's more like Berman or Burma or something. Anyway, Jakob Boehme, you'd spell it Jacob with a K, was the mystic upon, an alchemist, literally, upon whose works Hegel based most of his thinking. Arguably, maybe Kant was influenced as well, but I don't know. Kant is given, basically, Rosenberg says that Kant basically did the same thing as Eckhart, but in dry philosophy instead of spiritual terms. And again, that's the Aryan spirit shining through. Okay, that's enough digression into Eckhart, but it's a little bit of color for what we're talking about here. So it is that mighty fortress of the soul, that spark of which Meister Eckhart speaks again and again with awed admiration. What is it? It is that freedom and serenity of the soul that, release the profound depths into which we can follow the Nordic concepts of honor and freedom. It is that mighty fortress of the soul, that spark of which Meister Eckhart speaks again and again with awed admiration. It represents the most inward, most sensitive, and yet strongest essence of our race and culture. So it's a very German thing. He's saying it's German, not universal. It's not about humans. It's about Germans as a separate kind, better than other humans because of their Nordic lineage, allegedly, which goes back to Atlantis, also allegedly in this book. Eckhart does not give this innermost essence a name, since the pure subject of perceiving and willing must be nameless. So the subject inside the person, which perceives and wills, or in other words, subjective and objective, if we're talking dialectically, Eckhart doesn't name it. He doesn't give it a name, since the pure subject of perceiving and willing must be nameless, without essence, and separated from all forms of time and space. That means he's claiming that it's eternal and omnipresent. So it's very pantheist or panentheist in its organization, and again has a lot of kind of overlap with this sort of Hermetic line of thinking, although Hermeticism was not something that Eckhart possibly could have been looking at. It's also very likely that there's some Spinoza creeping in here, by the way, who was also a mystic in these kinds of lines, but him in the 15th century and going into the 16th. However, Rosenberg writes, today we may venture to describe this spark as representing the metaphysical allegory of the ideas of honor and freedom. So that's whatever compels the soul is your divine spark, and it is in fact the metaphysical allegory of the ideas of honor and freedom, whatever that set of words means in that order. But in the last analysis, honor and freedom are not the external qualities, but spiritual essences independent of time and space, forming the fortress from which the real will and reason undertake their sorties into the world. Okay, so honor and freedom are actually like well, he says fortress, but like the tank or the container through which true will and true reason, again, those being the second and third person of the Godhead in Eckhart's construction, will take their battles. So life is battles. The will and the reason bring their battles into the world, and freedom and honor are the fortress in which that is they're protected as they wage war. So the next section is called Eckhart, the Greatest Apostle. And he develops this very Gnostic sounding, feeling-ish, but not quite weird theme. Before it could fully blossom, he tells us, the joyous message of German mysticism was strangled by the anti-European church with all the means in its power. So just if this is your first episode, you're probably a little confused. The anti-European church is the Catholic Church. He is really down on it in the previous chapter. And so there was a joyous message of German mysticism, and the Catholics, thinking it heresy, perhaps in Eckhart's approach, strangled it with every method they had available. Even by the time we get to the Protestants, he'll point out, it still wasn't accepted. Nevertheless, he says, the message has never died. The mysticism has traveled on even though the church couldn't suppress it, or tried to suppress it. The great sin of Protestantism, he says, has been that instead of listening to the former, meaning the mysticism, instead of becoming pagan mystical, it made the so-called Old Testament into a folkish book and interpreted the Jewish texts literally. So his main problem, as I said in the previous episode, with Catholicism is that it set up a power structure that he saw as illegitimate, and his main problem with the Protestants is that it's too Jewish, which is a problem in his opinion. The present period of renewed spiritual readiness, he says, will either listen to the message of German mysticism or end up under the feet of the old forces before it has had time to unfold, like many past attempts at a transformation from Roman Jewish poisoning. So that means Christianity. Roman Jewish poisoning is Christianity. That's both German and both Catholic and Protestant that he's referring to. In fact, the Jewish part added on there is the key hint after he's just mentioned the Protestants are too Jewish. The Roman part is the Catholic Church. Jewish part is Protestant. This should remind you of woke right arguments today, by the way, that Protestantism is liberal and the direct attacks on dispensationalism is a Jewish plot. Just to kind of point out that this is in parallel to things we're actually hearing today from the radical woke right. Okay, so what he's saying is that, okay, so in there was German mysticism, it was joyous. The church tried to stamp it out. It couldn't do so. Protestantism took the wrong path. It did not cleave to German mysticism, which it could have done. Instead, it cleaved to Jewish Old Testament or Jewish Hebrew Bible stuff and took it literally. And now there's a new spiritual readiness because of why? Because of the transformation of the world scientifically, as I've been saying, culturally, and the cataclysm of World War I, making people look for something new. The old world has failed us. We need something new. In comes this Nazi ideology. That's the present period of renewed spiritual readiness. And he says it will either listen to the message of German mysticism or it will end up crushed under the feet of those same old forces, which are Christianity. So either it will be, this new movement, this Nazi movement will become mystical, or it'll be crushed by Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic. A will as hard as steel, he says, sounds a lot like Hitler, must today be joined to that illuminated mind and elevated spirit which Meister Eckhart demanded of his followers, and which is courageous enough to draw all proper conclusions from its avowal. If you wish to have the kernel, then you must break the shell. There is no doubt that that is a allusion to mystical thinking, maybe even to the Jewish process, what's that called? Simsum, where the divine vessels are broken and the divine spark is let out. If you wish to have the kernel, that divine spark, you must break the shell. Kind of ironic that might be the right allusion, that he's actually maybe alluding to Kabbalah here. It has been 600 years, he tells us, since the greatest apostle of the Nordic West gave us our religion. Notice that I told you it was our religion. Later, he literally identifies that religion as the religion of the blood based on the myth of the blood. He explicitly does so, but here he already calls it our religion, the German mysticism. When I first approached this chapter, since the last chapter is called Love and Honor, and then he contrasts those, this one's called Mysticism in Action, and I thought he might be contrasting them and he's going to put down all this mysticism. It is not the case. He is cleaving to the mysticism as the basis for action. Okay, and it is our religion, he says, the German religion, the European religion, is this mysticism as characterized in a Christian form by Eckhart, even though the Christian form is not necessary. But it has been 600 years since the greatest apostle of the Nordic West, that's Johannes Eckhart and his telling, gave us our religion, devoting a full life to ridding our being and becoming, we're going to rid both of those, of poison. What poison? The Roman Jewish poison that we just heard about, Christianity and Judaism, which I skipped a line there, which also, by the way, would include, ideas like universal humanity, whether it's Jewish, Freemason, or Indian, or whatever else. Everything that's not this Russian sympathy, all of these are different poisons, right? Because the fascist concept in general is the woke nationalists, as I like to call this part of it, in general, is that there's an authentic national body that was pure in the primordial past and has been poisoned or corrupted by different forces since. And so the return movement that they spell with a Roman V refers to restoring the original. That's seizing the means of racial production for the Nazis in order to reproduce the true Nordic German. And once you have restored the people and the values that work, then it's like going backwards and starting again. But the thing you go back to is pseudo-traditional. It's actually a myth. It's not a true story. But anyway, we're going to devote a full life to ridding our being and becoming, not just who we are now, but who we are becoming in the future. If you want to read Hegel into that, I don't think that's probably wrong, but you're going to rid that of poison, which came from mostly the Christian direction and the Jewish direction, into overcoming. What are we going to do? What did Eckhart give them the tools? Remember, Eckhart didn't technically get excommunicated, so what is he doing? He teaches them in their religion to devote their life to ridding our being and becoming of poison of Christianity, and to overcoming the Syrian dogma that enslaves body and soul. That's Christianity, in which awakens the God within our own bosom, the kingdom of heaven within us. That, y'all, is actually pretty Gnostic, although, like I said, it's in that weird Eckhart form where he doesn't hate the world that actually exists. The world itself is a miracle, but there's a greater miracle inside or something. But the God is within our own bosom and has to be awakened by breaking off from Christianity and even ideas of being good so that you can be great through your expression of will. This is what I'm telling you is the total story here. And what you find is that the kingdom of, and Eckhart did teach this, is that the kingdom of heaven is actually within us. So, do what you want with that, man. In the search for a new spiritual link with the past, notice what I just said about the structure of woke nationalist thinking. In the search for a new spiritual link with the past, there are those among the present-day movement for a renewal in Germany, that's Nazis, who wish to go back to the Edda and the cycle of related Germanic ideas. It is thanks to them that, alongside that which is pure fantasy, the inner richness of our sagas and folkish tales has again become visible from under the rubble and ashes left by the fires of the stake, again blaming Christianity for destroying the German pagan past and mystical path. But in pursuing this longing to find inner substance with past generations and their religious allegories, the German faith overlooks that Wotan or Odin is dead as a religious form. He did not die at the hands of Bonifacius. I told you in the previous episode about Boniface, who came and chopped down their pagan pole and tried to destroy all of the paganism in Germany and install Christianity proper. If I remember right, he was in the 8th century. So Odin did not die at the hands of Bonifacius, he says, but of himself. He completed the decline of the gods during a mythological epoch, a time of serene nature. His fall was already foreseen in the Nordic poems, although hopes were expressed for the coming of the strong one from above in light of the unavoidable twilight of the gods. In place of this, however, and to the misfortune of Europe, the Syrian Jehovah appeared in the shape of his representative, the Etruscan Roman Pope. Odin was dead, but the German mystic discovered the strong one from above in his own soul. That's a hell of a paragraph, guys. Okay, so what he said is some of the Germans looking back for their spiritual roots, some of the people in the Nazi movement. So this chapter has a lot of subtle, there's places where I don't quite know what he's doing, but it's clear he's taking shots at other Nazis with their different mystical beliefs and trying to assert his own. And this is one of these kind of places, right? So some of the people in our movement, he says, look all the way back, right? They look back to where they want to go back to Edda, which is EDDA, which has something to do with the original German folk mythology about their origins, and they appeal back to Odin. But what they don't understand, he says, is that Odin's already dead. Odin wasn't killed. He died according to the fall of mythology. But the hope at the time was that, the true spiritual power from above, the light from above, will come in and it will kind of save us. But that didn't happen, to the misfortune of Europe, because instead God, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Syrian deity Jehovah, appeared and took control. But he didn't do so himself. He did so in the shape of his representative, the Etruscan Roman Pope. Odin was dead again, he says, but the German mystic discovered the strong one that was supposed to come from above in his own soul. So God is actually inside the Nordic soul, the all-powerful strong one that is beyond such a conception, or the limitations even of Jehovah, is inside the soul. And the German was able to discover this, and his take is that Meister Eckhart, as the apostle 600 years earlier in the 13th century, was the one to be able to unleash that for the Germans, coming forward all the way into the Nazi movement. The Valhalla of gods, he says, descended from misty infinity into the breasts of men. So Valhalla is inside of you. The discovery and preaching of the indestructible freedom of soul was an act of salvation, one that has protected us up to the present against all attempts at strangulation. Again, that's by the church. The idea is that the whole previous chapter is that the church has tried to strangle the Aryan out of the German, or the European Nordic nature out of the German, and hasn't quite been able to do so. Western religious history, he says, is therefore almost exclusively the history of interdenominational upheavals. True religion within the church only existed insofar as the Nordic soul could not be hindered from unfolding, as for example with St. Francis and Brother Angelico, when its echo in Western man was too powerful. So the only time that the Catholic Church, or even the Protestant one, has ever spoken true religion is when a Nordic soul, like Meister Eckhart, like Johannes Eckhart, was able to speak through the church structure, as with St. Francis, as Brother Angelico, but also in Pinnacle, this is going to happen with Meister Eckhart. So when the Nordic soul was too strong to have the cap of Christianity holding it down and could break free, that's the only time true religion existed within the church. And again, he's going to hold up Eckhart's weird, almost sideways Gnostic theology as the example. Now, Eckhart openly denied that he was a Gnostic. Openly denied it. So it's, again, too much to call this strict Gnosticism. I know that people split these hairs, but in the general sense, it's still this kind of Gnostic philosophy that God is inside of you, or even that your soul is identical to God, or either now or after some kind of a spiritual transformation and communion. And therefore, basically, as actually we're going to hear from Rosenberg eventually, do as thou wilt is the philosophy that your will is genuinely good and for what it is, blah, blah, blah. Okay. The reborn German man, Rosenberg writes, appears on the scene for the first time consciously in the German mystic, even if in the garb of his day. Okay, so he's talking about Johannes Eckhart, that's the German mystic, and the garb of his day was Catholicism. So he had to dress up his German mysticism, his Aryan religion of old, his Wotan belief. He had to dress that up in Catholicism. That's what he's saying. Okay, so the reborn German man, German man was suppressed, and he's reborn when Eckhart comes around, appeared on the scene for the first time consciously, so also being aware of itself as such, in the German mystic, even if in the garb Catholic of his day. The spiritual birth of our culture was not perfected at the time of the so-called Renaissance, or I tried to say it British, Renaissance. Okay, I won't do that again. The spiritual birth of our culture was not perfected at the time of the so-called Renaissance or during the Reformation. The latter period, the Reformation, was more one of outward collapse and desperate struggles, but rather in the 13th and 14th centuries, when the idea of the spiritual personality became for the first time the supporting idea of our history, religion, and philosophy of life. So the spiritual birth of Germanic culture, P.S. Nazi, did not come about from the Renaissance. It did not come about from the Reformation. It came about in the 13th and 14th centuries when Meister Eckhart was writing his stuff. Okay, and that was when the idea of spiritual personality, have you noticed how many times Hitler talks about the central role of personality if you've listened to those podcasts or read Mein Kampf? Have you how many times personality, the individual personality, has come up within this particular series or this book? So the spiritual personality became the supporting idea for the first time of their history, that's Germanic European peoples and the Nazis, religion and philosophy of life, with Meister Eckhart. In this period, he says, the essence of our later critical philosophy was also consciously anticipated. In addition, the eternal metaphysical creed of the Nordic West proclaimed that which had effect on the souls of many ensuing generations, but could not generally manifest itself until the time was ripe, which he's attesting is now. So 600 years earlier, Meister Eckhart lays out this philosophy or theology or whatever, the German religion, and it has to wait for the Nazis to come out, and that's what he's trying to articulate. That's what Nazism is supposed to complete. And it's very interesting that the essence of our later critical philosophy was anticipated. And it makes me think of how Marx said about a century before this, not quite a century before this, that the origin of all criticism is the criticism of religion. Now, he's not criticizing religion in the abstract like Marx did and in all forms, except communism. He's criticizing the idea of the established religions in all forms as preventing the German soul from realizing who he is. So it's really in a very similar parallel to Marxism in that way. And the Nazis are the ones who are going to manifest this. So when I say what the F is Nazism as the title of this podcast, that's actually what I'm talking about. Okay, so the reborn German man appears on the scene for the very first time with Meister Eckhart acting as a Catholic, and nobody was ready until the Nazis came along to manifest this, along with their critical philosophy, their history, their religion, and philosophy of life, which he says is their German religion. More than 300 years, he says, had to pass until the name of Christ signified anything for the Mediterranean people. About 1,000 had to pass until the entire West was permeated by it. Confucius died mourned only by a few. His worship began 300 years after his death. 500 years passed before the first temple was built to him. Today, prayers are uttered to Confucius as the perfected Holy One. So, similarly, it took Christ 600 years to be recognized in the Mediterranean and 1,000 years across the West. Confucius was basically ignored for 300 years and another 200 years beyond that till he had a temple. And now, similarly, he says, 600 years also had to pass over the grave of Meister Eckhart before the German soul could understand him. Guess who's responsible for that? The Nazis. But today, he says, a revelation seems to spread through the people like the light of dawn, as if the time had come for the apostle of the German, the holy and blessed Master. Now he's going to lay out what that is, aside from the weird kingdom of God inside of us. An aristocratic spiritual creed is the next section. Every creature, he says, pursues its life with an aim, even if it be unknown to it. The human soul also has a destiny, that is to arrive at a pure knowledge of itself and a consciousness of God. Sounds a little bit like Gnosticism. But this soul is scattered and spread out in the world of the senses of space and time. This sounds a little bit like Gnosticism and also Hermeticism and also Kabbalah. The senses are active in it and thus weaken at first the power of spiritual concentration. The precondition of inner workings is therefore the withdrawal of all exterior powers, the extinguishing of all images and allegories. Okay, so this also echoes all of those other things that I've just mentioned. But basically, you have this inner sense of spiritualism that is, in fact, key and will be possibly developed in your life. But it's all spread out all across the world that we actually live in, all across our lives, space and time. And the senses are active in it, and at first actually weaken your power. Your ability to interact in the world, to detect the world, weakens the spiritual concentration, the spiritual power. So you're going to have to become an ascetic. You're going to have to pull away from the world, withdraw of all exterior powers, but that's also going to be of all exterior limitations, as we're going to hear in his philosophy, and set yourself free. These inner workings, he says, are meant to draw heaven to oneself, as Jesus is said to have testified and demanded of the powerful of the soul. So now you're supposed to withdraw from the world internally to your seat of freedom and honor in order to draw heaven into you or toward you to fulfill and complete your spiritual process. This attempt by the mystic thus demands the exclusion of the world as idea in order to become, where possible, conscious as pure subject of the metaphysical essence that lives within us. Since this is not completely possible, the idea of God is created as a new object of this soul in order to ultimately announce the identical value of soul and God. Okay, so God is an idea that is created since you can't actually fully become the pure subject. That's what he's saying. So we invent this idea of God as the new object of the soul so that we can say that the soul, the thing inside of us that we identify ourselves as and with, is in fact God. But God is a creation that we make up because we can't hit pure subjectivity and purely embody our soul. Yeah. However, WTF is Nazism. However, he says this act is only possible under the prerequisite of spiritual freedom from all dogmas, all churches, and all popes. So you're going to have this is very kind of Nietzschean in a way, you're going to have no church, no dogma, no rules of right and wrong, and no authorities telling you who and what you are or can be. Meister Eckhart, he says, the Dominican priest, does not shy away from joyfully and openly proclaiming this fundamental creed of every truly Aryan nature. During the course of a long life, he speaks about, quote, the light of the soul, end quote, as being without origin and uncreated, and preaches that God has placed the soul in free self-determination so that he wishes nothing of it beyond its free will, nor expects of it what it does not wish. Something big has happened there. God has given people souls. The soul is uncreated, therefore identical to God. It says, let's see, the light of the soul is without origin and uncreated. God has placed the soul in free self-determination so that he wishes nothing of it beyond free will. So what God wants you to do with your soul is to act with free will. He wishes nothing of it. He doesn't want your soul to do anything but be free to do what you will, okay? Nor expects of it what it does not wish. So God doesn't expect you to do anything you don't want to do or to not do anything you do want to do. He goes on to oppose the dogma of conformist faith by declaring that there are three things which prove the nobility of the soul. The first relates to the glory of the creature of heaven, the second, mighty strength, and third, the fruitfulness of its works. Before each going forth into the world, the soul must be conscious of its own beauty. The inward work of gaining the kingdom of heaven, however, can only be perfected through freedom. Your soul, he says, will bear no... Sorry, this is Rosenberg writing. There is no Eckhart here. Your soul will bear no fruit until you have accomplished your task, and neither God nor yourself will abandon these if you have brought yours into the world. Otherwise, you will have no peace, and you will bear no fruit. Even then, it is still disquieting enough because it is born of a soul which is bound to the outside world and whose tasks are controlled, not from a soul born in freedom. If the question arises why God became man at all, then the heretical Eckhart does not answer. Actually, let's come back to that because I'm almost positive he's going to say it more explicitly. But the do as thou wilt has already been actually explained as the creed of the Aryan, okay? That thing that God has placed the soul, the uncreated soul, in free self-determination so that he wishes nothing of it beyond its free will is an expression of do as thou wilt, nor expects of it what it does not wish. This is very, very do as thou wilt kind of thinking, just to kind of tie to that Luciferianism. But let's go back down where we left off. And if the question arises why God became man at all, that's kind of a weird twist. So why Jesus? Then the heretical Eckhart does not answer. So you have a Dominican priest who isn't answering why God became man. In order that we wretched sinners can record a superfluity of good works. Oh, sorry, he does not answer. He does have an answer. He does not answer that in order that we wretched sinners can record a superfluity of good works. But he says, quote, I answer that it is for the reason that God might be, this is Eckhart speaking, I answer that it is, why did Jesus take the form of a man? Or why did God come into the world as Jesus? I answer that it is for the reason that God might be born in the soul upon which a joyous credo follows. The soul in which God is to be born must have forsaken time, and time have forsaken it, must fly upward and stand completely strong in the kingdom of God, that is, width and breadth, yet which is neither wide nor broad. There the soul recognizes all things and recognizes them in their completeness. Whatever the masters write about how wide heaven is, I say on the contrary, that the smallest power that there is in my soul is wider than all the expanse of heaven. And that's the end of the Eckhart quote. Rosenberg comments, the current exposition of mysticism repeatedly emphasizes only the giving up of self, the throwing away of oneself to God, and this sees in this abandonment the essence of mystical experience. So the current exposition of mysticism, what does it mean to be the mystic? Emphasizes only giving up of self and throwing away oneself to God, and sees in this abandonment the essence of mystical experience. This viewpoint is understandable when one knows that it arises from the late mysticism falsified by Rome, and that it originates from the seemingly ineradicable assumption that self and God are different in essence. But whoever has understood Eckhart will have no difficulty in establishing that his abandonment is in reality the highest self-consciousness, one which cannot, however, be recognized in this world other than through an antithesis in time and space. The doctrine of freedom of the soul is one of freedom from God. That's in italics, by the way, emphasized. The doctrine of detachment signifies the utter rejection of the Old Testament and its ideas, along with the sickly sweet pseudo-mysticism of later times. So the doctrine of freedom of the soul is one of freedom from God, and the doctrine of detachment includes the utter rejection of Christianity and Judaism. That's literally what he's saying the mysticism is based on. These words about the soul's capacity for unlimited expansion are true mystical experience. Simultaneously, they signify the philosophical recognition of the ideality of space, time, and causality that Eckhart also asserts in other passages, proving and teaching in even more beautiful language than Kant, who was heavily burdened with natural science and philosophical scholasticism, was able to do 400 years later. So basically there he's saying that Kant and Eckhart are saying the same thing, but you can actually understand Eckhart, which is sort of funny about Kant. Heaven is pure and untroubled clarity, Rosenberg writes. It is touched neither by time nor space. Nothing corporeal has its place therein, so nothing corporeal has its place in heaven, and it is also not included in time. Its transmutation occurs with incredible quickness. Its course is itself timeless, but from its course arises time. Nothing hinders the soul so much in knowing God as time and space. Thus, if the soul is to perceive God at all, Rosenberg tells us, then it perceives him beyond and above space. If the eye is to observe color, then it must first be divested of all colors. If the soul is to see God, then it must have nothing in common with nothingness. God, as the positive expression of religious man, is, in the philosophical term, quote, the thing in itself, dich an sich, in the either Hegelian or Kantian German. It is grasped with the deepest reflection, not only as distant from impulse and image, as a result of which all nature symbolism is destroyed. In another passage, Eckhart says, quote, "Everything which has existence in time and space does not belong to God. The soul is complete and indivisible, simultaneously in foot and in eye and in every limb. The ever-present now in which God has made the world, the now in which I speak at this moment, is exactly as close as yesterday, and even Judgment Day is exactly as close to him in eternity as yesterday." The him here is not capitalized, but I don't know if it refers to the man or to God. A free spirit like Eckhart must necessarily draw the conclusion, hostile to the church teaching, that death is not, quote, "the wages of sin," as asserted by theologians who aim to put us in fear, but a natural and fundamentally unimportant event by which our eternal being, which was before and will be after, is in no way touched. So death is irrelevant. It is not the wages of sin. That's a fear-mongering doctrine of the theologians. It is a fundamentally unimportant event by which the soul will be untouched. With splendid gesture, Eckhart calls to the world, quote, "I am my own self's cause." Now, I'm just going to pause on that one for a minute. Remember, this guy's supposed to be Christian. "I am my own self's cause, according to my eternal and temporal nature. Only on this account am I born. According to my eternal manner of birth, I have been here from eternity and am and will remain eternally. Only what I am as a temporal creature will die and become nothing, for it belongs to the day, therefore it must like time vanish. In my birth all things were also born. I was simultaneously my own and all things' cause, and if I wished, neither I nor anything else would be, and if I were not, neither would God be." All right, so that's one hell of a little phrase there. From Meister Eckhart. I am my own self's cause, but he's talking about his soul. So he is the self-caused cause or the uncaused cause. His soul is therefore identical to nature. He was born as a person, and so it is, but his temporal creature will die and will become nothing, but that's fine. It'll vanish. But in his birth, I guess in his soul's birth and his soul's origin, which is eternal and always present, all things were also born. Well, there are a few ways to read that. One way is the completely subjectivist reading of reality, that until he was born, he had no subjective appreciation of everything, so everything exists inside of his mind. The other is that he's identical to God, or maybe both of these at the same time. He says, "In my birth all things were also born. I was simultaneously my own and all things' cause." So he caused himself, and he caused all of the universe to come into existence. He did himself, okay? Not God as some entity that's beyond him. He's therefore saying that he is the same as God. He is continuous with God. And he says, "And if I wished, neither I nor anything else would be. And if I were not, neither would God be." Just that's your spiritual Meister Eckhart there. And Rosenberg says, he boldly adds, quote, "It is not necessarily that one understand this." Now, I just watched a talk that was really interesting about neuro-linguistic programming techniques and propaganda. And when somebody adds, "You don't have to understand this, just believe it," they're actually like limiting your critical faculties so that you'll just buy some horse shit that they just spewed at you. Marx kind of does the same thing a little bit in Economic Philosophic Manuscripts when he can't resolve the infinite regressive chain of being, when he's trying to also say that man creates himself. Interesting. This is the thing that what's his name? Eric Vogelin, analyzing Marx for the same stunt, ends up calling him an intellectual swindler for doing. Oh, here we have like a theological swindler happening, and it is not necessary that you understand this at all. Don't worry, just accept it. Never before, Rosenberg writes, not even in India has there been such a consciously aristocratic spiritual creed that can be compared to that which Eckhart laid down. So even more than the The caste system-based theocracy, or theological, I should say, assumptions that the Aryans laid down to protect their race, and Rosenberg's telling in India, the best that they ever had. Even that the caste system wasn't even as aristocratic as a spiritual creed compared to what Eckhart laid down, because the soul is inside the individual, and the individual contains the kingdom of God, and in fact is continuous with God. So the awakened individual is basically above all of the temporal world. He was fully aware that he would not be understood by the age in which he lived. It would have to wait 600 years till the Nazis came around, I guess. Each of his words was an affront to the Roman Church because they were heresy. His words were perceived as such. As the most celebrated preacher in Germany, he was dragged before the Inquisition. The church, fearing his followers, could not do away with him as it did with other lesser heretics. But when Eckhart was dead, the church was again able to preach its infallible anathema over the most profound, or over even the profoundest German soul. But his teachings have lasted and have exercised a profound influence over the German soul and German history. That's actually true. So the church didn't like what he taught, deemed him a heretic, tried to clamp him down, and when he was dead, the church went back to preaching its normal stuff, ignored Eckhart's heresies. They didn't actually crush them the way that they frequently do. But it was able to preach its infallible anathema over the profoundest German soul. So it was basically the church waited till he was dead when his followers couldn't do anything about it, and we're like, no, he was wrong, and we're right, and we're the Catholic Church, so deal with it. But his teachings survived anyway in the German soul and throughout German history, which is true. Like I said, Jakob Böhme took him up. You see echoes of this in Goethe and the other places, and here the Nazis think he's just the bee's knees. From the unerring consciousness of the freedom of a nobleman and of a noble soul, there results a condemnation of so-called good works. So that's how you have the most aristocratic spiritual thing. You're a noble man with a noble soul, so you're noble, so you're above all else. And that's actually achieved through detachment from the world, just like the aristocrats detach from lower society. From the unerring consciousness of the freedom of a noble man and of a noble soul. The unerring consciousness of the freedom of the noble soul, there results a condemnation of so-called good works. So good works aren't necessarily really good, and the noble person is in a position in his aristocracy, spiritual aristocracy, of condemning them, as a matter of fact. These are no magical expedients, Rosenberg writes, such as Rome teaches. Remember in the previous chapter that he literally calls the Catholic Church like medicine man theology or whatever. That's all magic. Well, these are not magical expedients. This is nobility of the soul. These are no magical expedients such as Rome teaches, no credit which is booked with Jehovah, but merely a means of binding the impulsive world of the senses. So you have an impulsive life as humans that's not living up to its honor and its duty and so on, and therefore it can't act properly freely, and so it's binding the impulsive world of the senses, and therefore rising above. This isn't just magic tricks. What makes you noble and how you express your noble freedom, which is limitless and what you can do, is by binding the impulsive world of the world of the senses as a rein, as in to hold them back. Eckhart teaches, Eckhart teaches, must be laid upon the outer man to prevent him from running away from himself. A man should perform devout exercises, not merely to do something good for himself, but because he honors truth. He quotes Eckhart here, quote, "If a man finds himself given up to true inwardness," preaches the German apostle, I don't know why he has a random comment of his own in there, "then he boldly lets out all outwardness fall, even if he exercises to which he might have been..." I am killing this today. I apologize. "If a man finds himself given up to true inwardness," preaches a German apostle, "then he boldly lets all outwardness fall, even if it be exercises to which he might have bound himself by oath, from which neither pope nor bishop could grant release. No one can take an oath from him that has been made to God. To my knowledge, Rosenberg tells us this is the only passage in which Eckhart openly speaks aggressively of the Pope, but it shows his complete and self-reliant rejection of the fundamental laws of the Roman Church. Priestly arrogance is the next section, and that is the thing that is set in opposition, and this is the last section we'll go through, set in opposition to this free soul as outlined in the German mystic. This human greatness, uplifting all things, finds its hostile counterpart in priestly arrogance. One of the greatest orators of the 13th century, the lay brother Berthold von Regensburg, in other respects an interesting man, taught that if he saw the Virgin Mary alongside the heavenly hosts and a priest also present, then he would fall down before the latter rather than the former. Quote, "If a priest came to where my dear Lady, Holy Mary, and all of the heavenly hosts sat, they would all stand up before the priest. Further, whoever truly receives dedication as a priest has a power reaching so far and wide that emperor and king never possessed such a great power. Whoever makes himself subject to the power of the priest, even if he has committed a great sin, then the priest has the power at once to close hell to him and open up heaven." End quote. But what is this, Rosenberg says, but the most utter Syrian sorcery in which we have been enveloped? According to Eckhart, the noble soul of a man turned toward the eternal is the representative of God upon the earth. Now, I'll also point out that literally when you accept Sharia in Islam, you are said to be the representative of God upon the earth. Just to point that out. But he says it's not the church, the bishop, or the pope. Quote, "No one here on earth possesses the right to bind or release me, even less the right to do this as God's representative," end quote. Now, I actually agree with that. That's a Meister Eckhart thing. And this is one of the weird issues that keeps coming up, is that it's like Nazism is basically like Americanism done completely wrong. It's like Americanism with a psychotic, mystical ideology and race at its center and a dictator instead of equality and freedom. It's like I'm with Eckhart here, and if this is the German spirit being expressed as Rosenberg wants to convey, I agree. No one here on earth possesses the right to bind or release me, even less the right to do so as God's representative, end quote. So far what he's doing is priests are setting themselves up as the arbiters of who gets to go to heaven and hell. So priests get this undue, bogus respect. This is Syrian sorcery. He says this is the magic of basically priests, and that includes Jews and Christians. And Eckhart is having none of that, and because he's expressing that German freedom of soul. These words, Rosenberg says, which every devout man of the Aryan family of peoples could proclaim as his own creed. Notice it's also literally the American creed, so it's like that the Nazi experiment versus American experiment comparison is really interesting, because they seriously got this wrong, and some of this stuff is some of the same stuff, and we seriously got it right. But these words, which every devout man of the Aryan family of peoples could proclaim as his own creed, are naturally born of a completely different substance than the medicine man philosophy that Rome has fabricated for its own use, and whose dogmas all follow only the one aim of making mankind dependent on the Roman priestly caste and to root out any nobility of soul. So a little bit more kicking the Catholic Church here. In his sermon on the first epistle of John 4:9, Eckhart says, quote, "I assert decisively that as long as you do your works for the sake of heaven, of God, or for your own blessedness, thus outwardly, you are not really on the right path." Okay, so Eckhart's philosophy or theology: if you do your works for the sake of heaven or God, or for your own blessedness, thus outwardly, then you're not really on the right path. Whoever imagines that by contemplation, devotion, ecstatic feelings, and gross flattery he has done more of God than at the fireside or in the cow stall does the same thing as one who asks God and wraps a cloak around his head and pushes him under a bench. If one asked an honest man who works on a firm foundation, "Why are you performing your works?" then he would merely say, if he spoke properly, "I perform them to have effect." End quote. The teaching of the righteousness of works is regarded by Eckhart as a veritable whispering in the ear by the devil, and as far as prayer is concerned, he makes a popular appeal. Quote, "The people often say to me, 'Pray to God for us,' whereupon I think to myself, why do you even go out? Why do you not remain with yourself and reach down into your own treasure? In fact, you carry all reality within you according to your nature, so that we must thus remain in ourselves as the creatures we are and possess all reality of our own without mediation and diversity in real blessedness, and may God help us to do this." End quote. So again, you hear these weird things that sound almost Christian, and then they get super weird, right? Like, okay, Father, Meister Eckhart, pray for us. And I think, no, why? Why do you have the entire universe and God within you? Just reach into yourself. It's very weird, right? It's very weird. Eckhart is thus a priest, Rosenberg tells us, who would like to see the priesthood abolished, who would like to adjust his entire activity solely toward liberating the way for the man who seeks, who is regarded by him as essentially an equal and of equal birth, who will not enslave the soul by persuading it to eternal dependency upon Pope and Church, but who wishes to bring its slumbering beauty, its nobility, its freedom into consciousness. That is, who wishes to awaken its awareness of honor. In the last analysis, honor is nothing other than the free, beautiful, and noble soul. One more section, actually. I thought that we went a little further. It's called individual greatness. And I did ask Grok about some of this, and is Rosenberg representing Eckhart correctly? And the answer is kind of yes and mostly no. So just take that with a grain of salt. So individual greatness. The same striving to elevate man, writes Rosenberg, is perceptible when Eckhart rejects the doctrine of human weakness. Quote, "Therefore man can certainly imitate our Lord according to the measure of his weakness and needs, and indeed may not believe he can attain this." End quote. Once more, man is elevated, not denigrated, while Eckhart mockingly rejects those who claim to be justified by works. Quote, "And especially avoid all peculiarity, whether it be in the clothing, in food, in speech, in use of impressive words or extravagant gestures, with which indeed nothing creative is achieved." End quote. Then follows the clearest assertion of the right of the true personality. Quote, "However, you must know that in no way is everything special forbidden to you. There is much that is strange, which one must often retain and among many peoples. For whoever is a special man must also do something special at many times in diverse manner." End quote. In which respect, Rosenberg tells us, no exception is made for authority and priesthood, which is allegedly untouchable, even if the holder of the rank is a criminal. Each is to be measured solely by the greatness of his individual soul. That is in italics. So even if the rank is a criminal, if he has a great individual soul, and the Nazis define that in a particular way, then that's how you actually measure. Once again, Rosenberg tells us, we experience the consciously anti-Roman, consciously Germanic withdrawal inward. Jesus once caused a sick man to arise on the Sabbath and take up his bed, whereupon the pious of the land raised a great outcry. But Jesus answered with superior contempt that the Sabbath was there for the sake of man, not the man for the sake of the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. Consequently, man was also master over the Sabbath. The imitators of the Jerusalem Pharisees have also kept to the strict observance of all devout practices, ignoring the fact that the essence of man was a determining factor. So this is using Jesus to put man before God. Eckhart says to them, quote, "Believe me, it is also a part of perfection that a man exalts himself in his works, so that all his works form one whole. This must happen in the kingdom of God, where man is God." But the kingdom of God is inside of us, was what he already said. This must happen in the kingdom of God, where man is God. There all things will respond to him in a godly manner. There also man is a master of all his works. End quote. This relationship to outward action is more than unequivocal, Rosenberg tells us, but equally clear is Eckart's rejection of all those virtues that are held to have a basis in mysticism. Nothing is more characteristic of Eckart's outlook than the interpretation that he gives to Christ's words about Martha and Mary in Luke 10:38 through 42. Quote, everything finite is only a means. The unavoidable means without which I cannot reach to God is my work and my creativity in the here and now. Such things do not influence us at all and our concern for our eternal salvation, end quote. Rosenberg goes, here is a characteristic withdrawal by a German man from the Indian creed of the Atman Brahman doctrine, which is roughly Imago Dei, actually. Deeds are unimportant, although they are not to be disposed as such. Mary, sitting at Jesus' feet, appears to Eckart as the pupil. Martha, on the other hand, is the superior. Quote, Martha feared that her sister would remain rooted in ecstasy and beautiful feelings and wished that she might become like herself, end quote. Then Christ answered as follows, quote, be content, Martha. She has also chosen the best part, which may never be taken from her. This extravagance will soon quiet down. Luke 10:41 through 42. Quickly, the story there is that Jesus visits the house of Martha and Mary. Mary sits at Jesus' feet, listening and to him talk about whatever he has to say, while Martha does all the arrangements and the work. Then Martha scolds Mary for not helping her prepare things, and instead sitting there just taking in all of the words of Jesus, and Jesus says what she's doing is more important. And don't worry, it won't last too long. That's the story, and that's the interpretation. As one sees, Rosenberg says, Eckart's disinclination toward everything sweet and fluid goes so far as to give an opposite meaning to the clear sense of Jesus' words. So you have the clear idea of what Jesus says, which is what I just said, but the way that Eckart interprets it is everything finite is only a means. The unavoidable means without which I cannot reach to God is my work and my creativity in the here and now. Such things do not influence us at all in our concern for our eternal salvation. With unmistakable irony, Rosenberg tells us, Eckart speaks to the female heretics surrounding him, the Beguines, I think that's how you say that, Beguines, as the apostates were then called, quote, but now our good people desire to be perfect in such degree that no kind of love can move us any longer, and we are left untouched by love as by sorrow. They do themselves injustice. I assert that the saint is still to be born who cannot be moved. Even Christ did not achieve this, as is proved by his words, quote, my soul is sad unto death, end quote. Such words caused Christ woe, and that was because of his inborn nobility in the holy union of divine and human nature, end quote. He adds, quote, now people even wish, whoops, wrong button, sorry. I'm super lost, I apologize, I hit the wrong button. He adds, quote, now certain people even wish to bring matters to such a pass that they may be rid of his works. I say that this is not important. This we also find evidenced in Christ from the first moment onward when God became man and man God, and then he also began to work for our blessedness. There was no part of his body that was without its special share in this, end quote. Rosenberg asks, why did Eckart preach this anti-church doctrine? It was to allow spiritual freedom to prevail. That is the highest good that Eckart, and with him the Nordic Western man, recognizes. He expresses this in the following manner, quote, God is not a destroyer of any kind of works, but a perfecter. God is not a destroyer of nature, but its perfecter. If God had destroyed nature even before the beginning, then violence and injustice would have been done to it. He did no such thing. Man has a free will with which he can choose good and evil. God places the choice before him of evil doing, which brings death, and of right doing, which brings life. Man must be free and a master of all his works, undestroyed and unconstrained, end quote. Now you can tell which parts Rosenberg's going to cling to, unconstrained in particular. In these words, Rosenberg tells us the eternal mutually fruitful polarity of nature and freedom have been recognized and expressed in a splendid way, swept aside with the hand of a religious and philosophic genius, conscious of her intrinsic racial structure, I don't know where he's just added conscious of our intrinsic racial structure, is the barren Phariseeism, the torturing Oriental priestly justification by works. The sacred union of God in the nature is the sacred union of God in nature is the primal ground of our being, represented in the freedom of the soul, crowned by the fruitfulness of its works, and the driving power behind all is the will. According to the New Testament, the angel Gabriel came to Mary in Luke 1:26-38, but Eckhart smilingly says, quote, actually, he was no more called Gabriel than he was a messenger, that is, an angel. For Gabriel means power, really it means power of God. God was active in this birth and is still active as power, end quote. With this, the dynamic of Eckhart's soul is also revealed in the clearest light, the noble soul. Eckhart's freedom of soul necessarily prompts another evolution, not only of life and works, but also of the highest ideals of the Roman Church, of traditional Christianity in general, and thus of the entire revealed world then and now. Quote, if one recognizes the noble soul as the highest value, as the axis upon which everything is suspended, then the ideas of love, humility, mercy, pity, and so on form a second and third stage. Okay, so Rosenberg is saying that Eckhart's freedom of soul concept prompts another evolution of even Christianity. We need a new version of Christianity following Eckhart, and that's going to be the Christianity that's the foundation, stripping away the extra Roman stuff that's going to be the basis of the German Christianity that's going to serve as positive Christianity. Here, Rosenberg writes, also Eckhart does not shy away from hearing the voice of the little spark, from speaking freely what his soul says to him. Naturally, it does not need to be particularly emphasized that he does not disparage love, humility, or mercy. On the contrary, we find in his sermons the most beautiful words about these ideas, though he detests the sweet ecstasy of undisciplined, lovely feelings. In short, the lack of spiritual control. His doctrine of love is the representation of love as the power that knows itself to be identical with that divine power for whose victory it fights. That's some gobbledygook. Love must break through these things, for only a spirit love must break through these things, for only a spirit that has become free compels God to itself. So only a spirit that is, love has to break through all of these ideas, feelings, mercy, etc., because it has to be free. You can't be constrained by things like mercy and positive feelings and all of this stuff. Eckhart doesn't throw those away. He speaks beautiful words about them, but that's spiritual self-control if you indulge them. His doctrine of love is something else. Love must break through all of those things so that the spirit can become free, for only a spirit that has become free compels God to itself. So you're going to compel God to you by becoming free of all the strictures of things like including Christianity. One must consider what it meant for a Dominican prior to the beginning of the 14th century to undertake in the face of an intolerant world-ruling church a transvaluation of the values heretofore held to be the highest. Now that's a direct appeal to Nietzsche, as a matter of fact, and Nietzsche's moral project was, and as it says in the footnote, indeed to revalue traditional values of good and evil, since these have been for 2,000 years defined as malignant in the Judeo-Christian sense. He sought to restore the original Greek meaning of the terms in his Genealogy of Morals, third essay, section 27, and at the very end of his Antichrist. So that is a reference to Nietzsche as confirmed in the footnote. That was the footnote I just read. Indeed, Rosenberg goes on, it was risky to even attempt to communicate a new supreme positive value to the simple believer. He dared not attack Rome openly, rather he had to speak in terms of a positive metaphorical representation of spiritual experience. Bearing this in mind, one should read Eckhart's sermon on the loneliness of the soul, which I already related a bit to you, which is perhaps the most beautiful statement ever made of the awareness of the Germanic essence. Okay, so this is pretty important, not necessarily that last bit, but what he just said is where earlier he said that, the kind of saint or whatever, the German mystic appears in the close of his day. What he's doing here is saying that what we're going to do, what Rosenberg's project is going to do, is to reinterpret what Eckhart already wrote, which is a little bit weirdo, mystical, and heretical, in light of what he wants it to mean by stripping out anything he thinks is Christian and saying he couldn't have meant that because he was speaking in secret code to people who understood him, but understanding that he would have been burned at the stake by the Catholics if he was plain. So this gives Rosenberg license to write whatever nonsense he wants into the words of Eckhart by claiming he was speaking in code and covering his own tracks with the Catholics. In this, Rosenberg says, Eckhart deals with the highest values of the Christian church: love, humility, and mercy. Remember, we're supposed to blast past those for freedom through a transvaluation of values like with Nietzsche. And he finds that in loftiness, depth, and greatness, they must give way to a soul which is completely detached. That's the loneliness of the soul thing. He rejects Paul's glorification of love in particular, for the best thing about love is its impulsion to love God. But it is far more important that we impel God to us rather than impelling ourselves toward God. I don't know why I picture Michelangelo's painting on the roof of the Sistine Chapel with God, reaching to Adam and God's fingers fully outstretched, and Adam's is the lazy one, not reaching back to God when I read that. But he rejects Paul's glorification of love in particular, for the best thing about love is its impulsion to love God. But it is far more important that we impel God to us rather than impelling ourselves toward God. Only in this way, Rosenberg writes, can our soul become one with God. Therefore, God cannot avoid giving himself to a lonely heart. So you make yourself lonely. God is like, oh no, my child, and he is impelled to you. So he comes in and gives himself to you. So you lure God in through your loneliness and thus become one with God inside. This is a theosis-minded program of becoming one with God that's really deep in the Gnostic kind of thinking. And again, this is for Eckhart, the Godhead itself that's behind the Trinity or above the Trinity or something related to the Trinity, beyond the Trinity, that you're actually making communion with, so that you can get away from the Trinity and its boiling over into the existence of the material world and have the true experience of God. There's something weird here. This is the thing that actually Rosenberg is relocating, with no God really involved at all, but in the self and in the soul of the self, which is the German free Nordic soul. Okay? So, furthermore, it's not just God cannot avoid giving himself to a lonely heart. Furthermore, Rosenberg writes, the sorrows of this world in pursuing possessive love still relate to the creature. That is not the case with mystical detachment. So even in loving God, you're attaching is actually the philosophy that's being challenged here. And so you're trying to be possessive of God by loving God, which is of course not what any Christian I've ever talked to or any Jew I've ever talked to means by it. But that's how it's being translated here, and that is not the case, Rosenberg tells us, with mystical detachment. This detachment, by the way, basically means from morals, so you can be a fucking Nazi. That's what he's actually talking about. That's what it means to be great, is to be a fucking Nazi. That's what this is really about. Let's cut the bullshit. We're going to detach from God so that you are God being a fucking Nazi. That's what this is really about. Anyway, feel better now when I said that. This lessens the compulsion of the world and brings us nearer to God, he says. Eckhart is concerned that the virtue of humility might cause a lowering of man's self-esteem. Now, this is where it gets super weird and interesting. Eckhart is concerned that the virtue of humility might cause a lowering of man's self-esteem. Such a posture of humility might cause a man to lower his self-respect. Man's possession of a sense of inner worth is most important. Rosenberg writes, man must become detached from material concerns. Then he quotes Eckhart. Perfect detachment knows no looking down to the creature, no bending of self, and no elevation of self. It will be neither under nor over. It strives neither for equality nor for inequality. And with any other kind of creature, it does not wish this or that. It only wishes to be with oneself. End quote. So that's Eckhart, and Rosenberg's conclusion from that is that a man's possession of a sense of inner worth is most important, and we will not have humility because humility will lower our self-importance. Rosenberg goes on, the autocratic soul has nowhere expressed itself so sharply and clearly as here. The autocratic, self-ruling soul. So the soul is totally free to do whatever it will, and whatever it does is good. It is necessary rhythmic counter-movement after the recognition of fruitful work, that which Goethe later praised as the highest of all gospels, regard for oneself. That's the message of their religion, regard for oneself. Compassion, according to Eckhart, is nothing other than a giving of oneself. It is, for the same reason, not to be valued as highly as detachment. And because God's essence is also detached from all names, it also follows that nothing of lower order can approach him. Here, so we can't approach God because we're of lower order unless our souls are of equal order, so God has to come to us. And then we do that by making ourselves lonely, by detaching from everything. Eckhart sets a limit to the importance of prayer invested with so much magic. Quote, I maintain that prayers and good works are of little value to man, so great is God's detachment from man. Therefore, God is no more inclined toward man than if the prayer or good work had never been performed. Rosenberg comments, this is more than clear. He completely rejects any intercession based on or approximating magic. He rejects the idea of the church that can alone bring bliss. And then in conclusion, there follows a popular creed. Quote, keep yourself apart from all men, remain untroubled by all outward impressions, make yourself free of all that could give an alien addition to your essence. Now, Nazis are going to read that racially, by the way. P.S. Very important to note. And direct your mind at all times to holy contemplation, with which you bear God in your heart as the object from which your eyes never waver. End quote. Rosenberg says this calm, detached greatness of soul then expresses itself in the criticism of the Roman and later Protestant doctrine. Now, you can find all this kind of strange stuff in Eckhart, but in the quotes that Rosenberg's actually invoking, you don't actually find that much strange stuff, right? You find a weird theology, but Rosenberg's really taking it somewhere else. And his justification for that was that it was, he was expressing it in Catholic terms so he wouldn't get himself in trouble. But that allows him to do whatever he wants to extend Eckhart's claims in the direction of Nazi stuff. In this world of appearances, Rosenberg says, spiritual strengthening as a result of inward concentration cannot be imagined by us otherwise than as a gift of the eternal essence of God. Against this background, Paulinism, with it all Christian churches, has built up the doctrine of grace as the highest mystery of Christianity. The Jewish representation of the slave of God, one who receives mercy from an arbitrary absolutist God, has thus passed over to Rome and Wittenberg, so that's Catholic Church and Protestants, and can be attributed to Paul. He is the actual creator of this doctrine, now all in italics. It can truly be said that our churches are not Christian but Pauline. Jesus praised being with God. This was his redemption, his goal. He did not preach a condescending granting of mercy from an almighty being, in the face of which even the greatest human soul represented a pure nothingness. This doctrine of mercy is naturally very welcome to every church. With such misinterpretation, the church and its leaders appear as the representatives of God. Consequently, they could acquire power by granting mercy through their magic hands. A genius like Eckhart had to adopt a position completely different from the concept of compassion. Okay, so the doctrine of grace is really just another way that churches end up controlling people. The doctrine of mercy is very welcome to the churches because it's a misinterpretation that allows them to control people. And Eckhart and the Nazis represent something different, Rosenberg's telling us. He also finds beautiful words about love and mercy of God. Quote, where compassion is in a soul, then this soul is pure and godlike and God-related. End quote. Even though he just bashed the whole idea of being compassionate. Eckhart's man achieves the fullness of the soul rather than submitting to the depths of subjugation. Man seeks to move inward and to adhere to and to be one with God. That is true mercy, true compassion. This compassion is probably impossible through philosophies that teach only God's universal power and our nothingness, such is the case with our churches. So there's a little nugget that was hiding here. It's come up twice now, our nothingness next to God's greatness. which is that unless our soul, God is infinite, we are finite. So our souls, if they are anything at all to God, they're either nothing at all, which is all these problems he's bringing up, or there's only one possibility, they're also infinite. But if they're also infinite, they're part of the same infinite, which means our souls are actually identical to God already, which is again getting into that Gnostic heretical territory pretty deeply. The truth, on the contrary, Rosenberg writes, is that that man's soul is like unto the Spirit of God. Eckhart here refers to Augustine's Confessions, works well known to Eckhart, whose teachings about the soul nevertheless led to a complete spiritual breakdown. Augustine demands the death penalty for heretics. Augustine's City of God was written to produce a spiritual slavery in man. The only thing I'm shocked about here is that he didn't call him the African Augustine over and over again. But Eckhart assumes a different state of man's soul. Quote, if it did not possess this greatness, then it could not become God even through grace. So here we have the idea that the grace of Christianity, maybe, or by some other means, the human soul becomes God. That's theosis, which is, the Orthodox people are going to be like, no, it's fine, bro. But everybody else is going to be like, wait, what? Here again, we find the characteristic position of the superior Nordic man in developing his thoughts on the basis of a clear spiritual instinct. Eckhart of Hochheim was of Thuringian nobility. There's the little genealogical thing. So he has clear spiritual instinct because he is Eckhart of Hochheim, and therefore, as Eckhart of Hochheim, he is, in fact, of noble German blood. So Nordic man, in developing his thoughts on the basis of clear spiritual instinct, in the face of the assertions of the dissolute, slavish, bastardized Augustine, by partaking in the lasting vitality of God, the soul is elevated to ever higher light. Rosenberg writes, quote, then every power of soul becomes the copy of one of the divine persons. The will is the copy of the Holy Spirit, the perceptive power, that of the Son, the memory, that of the Father. Its nature becomes the likeness of nature. And yet the soul remains indivisibly one. That is the ultimate knowledge that my self-recognition allows, end quote. The supreme avowal, Rosenberg tells us, then follows. Quote, now here, as to how far the soul becomes God, even above grace and mercy, what God had in fact provided you shall not change again, for it has attained a higher position where it no longer has need of grace, end quote. One should compare this splendid aristocratic creed with the touching, struggling, yet half-African, there it was, Augustine, in his assertions about human morality and its perpetual sinfulness. Thoughts are openly expressed here by Eckhart, which even Luther, whose ideas were still inhibited by his education under the representative of Christ, that's the Church and the Pope, still did not dare to think. So Eckhart went further than Luther, but he didn't get this kind of credit. I said that we were going to stop like 2 sections ago. In fact, I was only going to read the first 2, and I wasn't even going to read anything about priestly arrogance. But like, I'm on a roll here. So the next one's called Sin and Repentance. So let's just add that on. Maybe we'll find a good stopping place. From this attitude to the idea of grace, there also results with Eckhart a totally different estimation of sin and repentance. Quote, sin is no longer a sin once we repent. Quote, end quote, sorry, are the words with which Meister Eckhart begins his sermon on the blessings of sin. It kind of reminds me of the line from Seinfeld where George Costanza says, remember, it's not a lie if you believe it. It really, sin is no longer a sin once we repent. Okay, so this is Eckhart's soteriology. That's the fancy word for this. These are words that led him miles away from the contrition usually demanded. So Rosenberg's case is that Christianity demands Christians feel sorry and contrite about their sin, whereas the Nordic would never do that because he's a noble soul doing noble things and doesn't have this sense of being a sinning creature. So he's not limited. So therefore, by notions of being good or bad, therefore he can be great. So the great individual Nordic personality is achieved by relinquishing the idea of being bound by ideas of good that are being sinful or not. These, Rosenberg says, are usually words that lead him miles away from the contrition usually demanded. Naturally, we ought not to sin, but even if the individual action has been directed against God, then the great and splendid God nevertheless knows how the best is to be gained from such an action. Thus, God does not add up the past in some accounting book, for God is a God of the present. So your past doesn't really matter to God because everything's an eternal present to God. So God's not adding up all of your bad deeds. He's figuring out how to turn your bad deeds into good. And Eckhart thus takes another step away from the historical materialism of our churches. Only later did Paul de Lagarde dare to speak so openly as once did this Dominican friar from the 14th century. For this reason, Lagarde was condemned by the Protestant priests as Eckhart once was by the Roman. Eckhart distinguishes two types of repentance, that which is of the senses and that which is godly. The first, which the church clearly understood, remains rooted in mystery and does not move from the spot. It thus signifies only unfruitful lamentation. Nothing comes of it. So you're sorry, I'm so sorry, I feel bad. Nothing comes of it. Things are otherwise with divine repentance. As soon as inner disapproval arises in man, he at once elevates himself to God and sets himself with unshakable will, armed securely against every sin. Thus here the direction upward is stressed anew, and everything is evaluated not only according to whether it made the soul creative, elevated or not, quote, but whoever may really have come into God's will not wish that the sin into which he had fallen might not have existed, end quote. This is the same as Goethe asserted, tells us Rosenberg, when he declared that a human teacher would also appreciate error, quote, what is fruitful alone is true. Okay, so if you didn't catch that, what he just said is, okay, so if you're just wailing and blubbering that you feel bad because you were bad, you're not really doing anything. What you actually have to do, and I don't disagree with this part, is you actually have to go inside and change yourself. As one of my ex-girlfriends used to tell me in rather abusive form, sorry means changed actions. Okay, and so you go inside and transform yourself. But therefore, your sin was a vehicle to your elevation. So your sin, once you've repented of it that way, wasn't bad. And in fact, it's kind of a gift, right? So sinning is not something we worry about, because if you make it right in your heart, you elevate yourself. And therefore, it was necessary to becoming better. So this is an interesting soteriology, to say the least. Seen from Meister Eckhart's standpoint, Rosenberg writes, that is, from the perspective of one who is detached, godlike, free, beautiful, and has a noble soul, all the traditional highest church values appear to be of second and third rank. Love, humility, compassion, prayer, good works, mercy, repentance. All these are good and useful, but only under the one condition that they strengthen the power of the soul. That's in italics. Elevate it, make it become more like God. If they do not, then all these virtues become useless, even harmful. So the virtues are even harmful unless they are used as a measuring stick to make yourself more like God. Why? Because they limit greatness. That's why. The freedom of soul is a value in itself, tells us Rosenberg. Church values merely signify something in relation to a moment outside them, be it God, soul, or the creature. The nobility of the self-reliant soul is the highest of all values. Man must serve the cause of the noble soul alone. We of the present day call it the deepest metaphysical root, this idea of honor, which is likewise an idea in itself without any relationship to any other value. The idea of freedom is inconceivable without honor, just as honor is without freedom. The soul is capable of good in and of itself, even in italics, even without any relationship to God. Eckhart teaches that the soul is released from all else insofar as this release can be expressed in words at all. As a result, Meister Eckhart shows himself not as an ecstatic enthusiast, but as the creator of a new religion, our religion, released from that injected alien spirit of Syria, Egypt, and Rome. Okay, the next section is called Prefiguring Kant. That one's its own kind of interesting thing, but we don't need to continue. What the fuck is this? What the fuck is Nazism? What is this? Of course, I think Hitler got to this part and was like, what the fuck is this? Because he called this mystical nonsense. And I remind you again that where this is going is this metaphysic that it's laying out, first of all, is itself a metaphysic of excusing immorality to do great deeds. It's in line with the great man theory of history, which the Nazis, likely Rosenberg, would have looked back to Thomas Carlyle for inspiration. This idea that when men act in great ways, big history-changing ways, then they're sort of self-justified, because that's how history works, is by great individual personalities saying screw it all and doing whatever they want. Now, this book on heroes that Thomas Carlyle wrote, very famous about this, the second hero he does out of 6 is Muhammad, and he just praises Muhammad for dozens and dozens of pages in this chapter. It's really a real piece of work. And the reason that Islam and Muhammad is all fantastic is because of how influential it was. If it wasn't great, it wouldn't have succeeded. And this is actually very common in the fascist and proto-fascist and counter-revolutionary literature. Like, if somebody's doing something big and impactful and with lasting measure, it must have intrinsically been good somehow. So it's like, that's like the mentality of a school shooter or something, or a serial killer. Oh yeah, I'm going to get him, man. Everybody's going to remember my name now. And that means you're a great man of history in some sense, even though what you did is like hugely evil. And so anyway, what you're looking at is this metaphysic. That's where I was going. That metaphysic is this breaking away from goodness in order to do greatness as the individual soul, even with this all being rooted in a Christian theosis, semi-Gnostic, slightly hermetic kind of context from a Dominican friar in the 13th and 14th centuries. And then there at the end, even being removed from God doesn't really have to be a part of it, guys. Like God, whether God's there or not, it's the nobility of the soul, which is intrinsic to the German race. That's the myth of the blood part that forms the basis of their religion, which is, like I said, that Luciferian empiricism pairs with a Luciferian metaphysic, actually, that do as thou wilt, first of all, but that goodness is defined by greatness, and greatness is defined by scale and impact, not necessarily by whether or not it honored God or did the right thing or brought about a beneficial or good result. It just has to be great. It just has to be world-changing, right? So Stalin and Hitler and Mao and all of these terrible people are great men of history. Muhammad is a great man of history by these reckonings. And that's the metaphysic. And that thing gets paired with the Luciferian empiricism. And then he explains that, we had a Luciferian era, which is defined as good, up until World War I shattered it. That is the cataclysm that I'm talking about. We have this destabilizing world, the shattering of what was apparently a Luciferian world. Frederick the Great is another one, by the way, of the characters in Carlyle's book on heroes. And it is said that various officials within the top brass of the Nazis would read from the chapters of Carlyle to Hitler, particularly the chapter of Frederick the Great, and Hitler would sit there crying, marveling about it. He was so emotionally moved by it. So we can't ignore this idea that greatness is kind of at the center, even at the expense of goodness of their concept, and that somehow this Luciferian project, which is what he explicitly calls it himself, is then put in contrast to an evil satanic one that is defined by doing things that actually make the world better in measurable and material ways, instead of this whatever this is. Okay, but this whole idea that the kingdom of heaven is within us, that the soul is there, and this is like one with God. I'm sure there are some people out there that are like, Orthodox bros are going to be like, no, man, that's just theosis, calm down. But I'm like, I'm not calming down. This is weird. This is weird. And why the German Protestants and Catholics, virtually zero of whom were Orthodox, would have gone on board with this is a complete mystery to me. We'll do some more out of this chapter. I did a whole lot more in this episode than I originally intended to. I think we covered actually about half of the chapter. It's not as long as the previous ones. But man, just again, I just am left with WTF is Nazism. You know, this is that balm. The myth of the blood, as I've characterized it before, is this balm for the humiliated soul. Nazi ideology is like a therapy for the humiliated German national psyche and individual psyche. And I mean, like I said, even Hitler was wigged out by this part, but like, this is weird. This is dark stuff. It has been unsettling to me reading it to see that, oh, it's just more of this I am becoming God stuff. At least Mussolini has the decency to just say that the state is God, right? Or it takes the place of God. Like, he at least has the decency to just do that. But this from Rosenberg, I think Hitler kind of agreed with Mussolini on that. But this from Rosenberg is deep, dark stuff. And remember, Rosenberg is also the one who says that in Positive Christianity that Hitler is the next prophet. Hitler is the one bringing the next revelation to the world. So, yeah, I just closed the way I started. WTF is Nazism, man. Just what the fuck is this?